Welcome, online viewers. My name is Terence Maloon. The subject of this lecture is how the woodblock print gained a new lease of life through a series of experimental works by Paul Gauguin. On the face of it, Gauguin's woodcuts were crude, amateurish, not the sort of thing you would expect anyone to take all that seriously, and yet they become an important carrier of ideas and an incitement to radical experiments with pictorial form. Within 2 decades, the woodblock print, distinctively marked by Gauguin's brand of primitivism, became a leading edge of avant-garde art. Kandinsky's landmark publications, his book Klänge, that's an image on the screen, published in 1912, his book concerning the spiritual in art, published in 1911, and the Blaue Reiter Almanac, a collaborative undertaking between Kandinsky and Franz Marc, published in 1912, were accompanied by a profusion of woodblock prints. These publications marked the initial appearance and the initial justification of non-objective or abstract art. Here are 2 illustrations from the Blaue Reiter Almanac. A low relief wood carving by Gauguin, very closely related to his woodblock prints, of course, and a child's drawing, one of several reproduced in the Blaue Reiter Almanac. This landmark publication is an incredible, unprecedented compendium of varied and incommensurable things that were linked together and celebrated under the aegis of modernist primitivism. The advent of abstraction was portrayed by the editors Kandinsky and Franz Marc as a phenomenon, maybe the phenomenon, produced by the convergence of all these modalities of primitivism, so-called primitivism, imputed primitivism, but we can't get too pernickety about the term because it's a historical phenomenon we need to appreciate in its own right. And so how the advent of abstraction and the implantation of the primitivist woodblock print became so very closely intertwined is the subject of this lecture. The print on the upper right wasn't printed by Gauguin. It was printed posthumously, and you can see that it's been tidied up. And there was consistency in the edition of this version, whereas the proofs from Gauguin's own hand, or made under his instruction, tend to be either one-offs, dissimilar to one another, and clearly provisional, searching, and inconsistent. When Gauguin first exhibited his woodcuts and when they began to circulate from hand to hand among artists and collectors in France, then in Germany, and then in Russia, and were reproduced in a couple of avant-garde periodicals, nothing could rival them in their extremism. Evidently, they were completely barbarous, unskilled, rough, crude, devil-may-care. Their figuration was blatantly anti-naturalistic, stylized, and simplified to an extreme. Their style, or lack of it, was overtly primitive. There was nothing you could point to in the contemporary art of the time that could rival their reckless flouting of professional norms. But don't be lulled into thinking that there was any material advantage to be gained by putting such risky experiments into the public arena. There was not at all. In fact, the last generation of academic gods was still very much alive in this period. Bouguereau, whose painting you see here, died in 1905, and he outlived Gauguin by 2 years, and Van Gogh by 15 years. Cézanne outlived Bouguereau by only a year. There were dozens of the old dinosaurs of the Academy who remained very successful and famous throughout the 1900s, into the 1910s, with a few even surviving into the 1920s, but they're not our concern. Nonetheless, let's face the extraordinary fact that an artist of Bouguereau's standing and accomplishment should be well nigh forgotten today, whereas even Gauguin's most casual, most barbarous dabblings are now more highly considered and respected. In this painting by Bouguereau, the idealization, the affectation of perfection and purity, the thoroughbred classical pedigree, none of it any longer works for us, certainly not in the way it had impressed Bouguereau's contemporaries. The plumpness of the lady's hands and the sheen of her fingernails would have wowed 19th century viewers and excited the avidity of collectors to an equivalent degree that the crudeness of Gauguin's work, not to mention its rustic or exotic subject matter, would have repelled and revolted them. Distorted anatomies in Gauguin's and Cézanne's figure paintings were beyond the pale, of course, whereas Bouguereau's slates of hand, to the contrary, seem to have more or less passed unremarked. 19th century viewers were blind, it seems, to the liberties taken by Bouguereau here, to the fact that the figure in the foreground has been amputated at the knee. Were she to flex her leg and tuck her left foot under her right thigh, her thigh wouldn't be in that position. Similarly, the second figure's flexed leg is anatomically impossible, as well as being grossly misproportioned. But think what you may, Bouguereau was a man of art, and it was the shape of the silhouette that concerned him more than anatomical niceties. Barbarism, primitivism. These are terms that crop up repeatedly in the art we have already seen and in the commentaries we've tended to privilege. Barbarism and primitivism are terms that link very disparate phenomena, Courbet's realism to Picasso's filibustering debut. These terms were applied willy-nilly to plein airism, to various aspects of naturalism and impressionism. They crop up in those important debates about the status of the painted sketch and those important questions about how to assess the completeness and sufficiency of a visual statement. We're going to try to match up some of these examples and see if there's any consistent sense we can make of their purported primitivism. So let's begin with this painting by Courbet. It's a problem painting, that's for sure, evidencing a very singular, counterintuitive rationale that raises more questions than it deigns to answer. The Artist's Studio, that's its principal title. And there you have a self-portrait in the center of the painting, Courbet's female model, one of two naked figures, has shed her clothes. But the painter is not looking at her, he's painting a landscape. And there's no affectation of plein airism here. It's a very conventional studio landscape composition, an idealized landscape. The artist is being watched by a young boy and a frisky white cat. You'll note that to the right, there is another child drawing on a sheet of paper on the floor. The full title he gave to this painting was The Artist's Studio, a Real Allegory, summing up 7 years of my moral and artistic life. The painting is immense, about 3.5 meters tall by 6 meters wide. That is about 11 feet by 19 feet. So what does he intend with the term a real allegory? Real is the war cry of realism. Realists claim to portray the unvarnished truth. And allegory is a story or a visual proposition in code, where one thing stands for something else, for an idea. The woman who has let her pink dress fall to the ground personifies an abstract idea. She is truth, beauty, inspiration, painting itself, perhaps all of these. On the right of the painting is an assembly of people Courbet called his shareholders or his stakeholders. They were the people whom he believed had a vested interest in him and his art. They were educated middle-class folk, his collectors, his patrons, his critical supporters, and a couple of leftist intellectuals who'd befriended him. On the left of the painting, the actual left, is a strange rabble. If this is an allegory summing up 7 years of my moral and artistic life, as Courbet claimed, do these represent people who might have passed through the studio as models over that time? Courbet's explanation was that they belonged to the world of everyday life. They include a fallen woman clutching a baby to her breast, a hunter and his dogs, a Chinaman, represented according to the prevailing stereotype, a Jewish rabbi, also according to the prevailing stereotype, bearded and wearing a black turban. The man in black with a top hat may be an undertaker. This evocation of a multifarious humanity is confined to one side of the picture. So there's a kind of face-off, which Courbet has contrived between his stakeholders and the riffraff, insiders and outsiders, bourgeois and proletarian. The important thing here is that he's implied their complementarity, their relatedness. You can't be an insider if there aren't outsiders. You can't be respectable without excluding the rabble. You don't have civilization or a definition of civilization that people can believe in without there being outsiders, barbarians. Indeed, you don't have academic art, classicism with all its obsession with purity and rectitude without evoking its nemesis of primitivism. The academic standard also decreed what was peripheral to it. This point was excellently made in a book by Francis Connolly, The Sleep of Reason. in which we're told that culture and non-culture appear as spheres which are mutually conditioned and which need each other. Each type of culture creates its corresponding chaos. So Courbet's allegory implies the brinkmanship that will become so characteristic of his successors in the history of modern art. The small boy looking up at the painter is a sort of mascot to the idea of realism and naturalism in painting. The innocent eye, someone who can see impartially and candidly, as yet unencumbered and uncorrupted by worldly knowledge. The chap who keeps popping up in the most interesting places you may have recognized. Could it be? Yes, it is. Baudelaire, slouched over a book on the far right. He's one of Courbet's acknowledged stakeholders, and he's there for a very significant reason, because the thematics of this painting chime in with passages in Baudelaire's critical writings. The thematics of modernist primitivism get an early airing, sometimes for the first time, sometimes definitively, in Baudelaire's polemics. Here's what he had to say about the innocent eye. Genius is childhood, voluntarily regained. Childhood that is now equipped to express itself through adult organs and with an analytic spirit, which enables it to organize the sum of material content that has been involuntarily gathered. The child sees everything as novelty. A child is always intoxicated. Nothing resembles what we call inspiration more than the way a child absorbs shapes and colors. How very striking. The innocent eye perceives shapes and colors. The primacy of perception registers the data of shapes and colors and can be excited by them and responsive to them. In 1912, 50 or so years after Baudelaire published the comments we've just heard, Kandinsky put down his own thoughts about the innocent eye in an essay in the Blaue Reiter Almanac. The practical, purposeful element is foreign to the child, since the child looks at each thing with unaccustomed eyes and still possesses the unclouded ability to register the thing as such. Only later does the child slowly become familiar with the practical, purposeful element through many and often sad experiences. Thus, the inner resonance of the object reveals itself of its own accord and without exception in every child's drawing. We'll have considerably more to say about this topic, which runs through the history of modern art, but there are other strands that coexist in a sort of braiding of ideas that we have to keep in mind at the same time. Fortuitously, or maybe not fortuitously at all, these are all themes in Baudelaire's critical writings. So his presence as a cornerstone of Courbet's painted allegory may be more than justified. Barbarous. The term meant the opposite of civilized in the classical worlds of Greece and Rome. Barbarians were outsiders. Barbarous was a word that was adopted by 19th century academicians. It was adopted in the realm of the fine arts to mean non-academic, unclassical, unprofessional, non-Western, uncouth, clumsy, naive, childish. But in principle, Baudelaire was sympathetic to and receptive to what his contemporaries regarded as barbarous, just as, in principle, Courbet had shown himself to be. What did Baudelaire have to say about barbarousness? Quite a lot. For the ancient Greeks, barbarians were foreigners belonging to another nation or culture. Barbarians were, by definition, incomprehensible because of their language or dialect or pronunciation, and the origin of the word is thought to be onomatopoeic. Barbar, like blah blah, that was what a language other than one's own sounded like to ancient Greeks. Ba, ba, ba. The opacity of language, the opacity of signs, the loss of intelligibility, the intentional estrangement of signs and symbols, that's characteristic of certain modernist experiments, and it presupposes a special kind of tolerance and complicity on the part of readers and viewers, of course. Here's what Baudelaire's thoughts were on the topic. Everything is hieroglyphic, and we know that symbols are only obscure in a relative sense. That is to say, according to the purity, the goodwill, or the innate clairvoyance of souls. Moreover, what is a poet if not a translator, a decipherer? Kandinsky in 1912, in an essay in the Blaue Reiter Almanac, writes a justification, a celebration even, of the hieroglyphic, the sign, being defamiliarized, not yielding up any determinate meaning. And I quote, "If the reader looks at any letter of these lines naively, that is, as an object, instead of as a familiar symbol, as something other than the practical, purposeful cipher man has created, the reader will see this letter as a physical form which makes a specific impact. Once the practical, purposeful attributes of the sign are lost, the ramifications of our inquiry greatly increase. If in a picture a line is freed from the aim of designating something and can function as the thing itself, its inner resonance is not compromised and can function fully. You may well question, you may well mistrust and disapprove of where Kandinsky's argument seems to be heading, but there's an important continuity with Baudelaire's preoccupation with hieroglyphics. Later in this lecture, we'll be able to see just where this is going to lead us. Barbarism. This is Baudelaire again. I want to talk about a barbarism that is inevitable, synthetic, childish, which is often visible in perfect art, Mexican, Egyptian, or Ninevite, and which derives from the need to see things grandly, to consider above all, the effect of the whole. It wouldn't be out of place to mention here that many artists have been accused of barbarousness, all of them painters whose vision is synthetic and reductive. Monsieur Corot, for instance. Here's a real puzzle, the painting on the left. Who painted it? It's a bewildering mixture of competency and naivety, with the linchpin being the woman seated at her spinning wheel, who is disturbingly out of scale in relation to the loiterers leaning against the wall. Is this a painting by Douanier Rousseau, whose sweet tonality and punchy contrasts it seems to suggest? No, it's a painting by Corot. And you can compare its qualities with Baudelaire's description of the qualities deemed to be barbarous. Barbarous means synthetic, childish, holistic, bold, and simplifying. Barbarous means, in effect, the operation of an innocent eye. Superficially, or maybe not altogether superficially, these barbarous qualities can be discerned in this painting by Manet. Manet's contemporaries certainly thought so. The painting was compared to a playing card. It seemed as flat and schematic as a playing card. It was compared with an image d'Épinal. Image d'Épinal were the popular prints in France, which had flat, garish colors, rather like American comic books. When Émile Zola took up Manet's cause and wrote a pamphlet in his defense, he justified Manet's alleged primitivism by asserting the innocence and purity of his vision, the clarity with which he saw and articulated values, that is to say, relationships of color and tone. And I quote, "Placed before some subject, the artist lets himself be guided by his eyes, which perceive this subject in broad color patches. A head, posed against a wall, is no more than a patch, more or less white, against a background more or less gray. And the clothing juxtaposed with the figure becomes, for example, a patch more or less blue, put beside a patch more or less white. From this a great simplicity results. There are almost no details, an ensemble of accurately judged, delicate patches, which from a couple of paces away lends the painting a striking relief. I emphasize this characteristic of Manet's works because it dominates everything else. It makes his works what they are. The entire personality of the artist consists in the manner in which his vision is organized. He sees things light and pale, and he sees in masses. From this very sensible, straightforward description of the painter's method, we get quite a lot of take-home points because Zola is describing a process of abstraction, which he equates with primitivism, despite the fact that the word primitivism isn't mentioned. Manet's abstraction involves an estrangement from the subject, focus on the medium, forgetfulness of precedent, simplification, directness, the analysis and synthesis of color patches or tache, the imprint of his sensibility, the evidencing of his individuality, and the expression of his subjectivity. On the left is an old sign showing a vendor of Image d'Épinal, and on the right an example of one of these. Primitivism and the innocent eye, the story continues. Estrangement from the subject, focus on the medium, simplifying, breaking down the motif into tâches, building up an image from those tâches. The adventure continues. Another great French writer, the poet Jules Laforgue, wrote one of the best appraisals ever of Impressionist painting, and I'd like you to consider what he has to say. In a landscape bathed in light, where the academic artist sees the light as whiteness, the Impressionist sees everything not bathed in dead white, but as 1,000 vibrant combats of rich, prismatic decompositions. Where the academic artist only sees the exterior outline enclosing a volume, the Impressionist sees real living lines of no geometric form, but made up of 1,000 irregular touches which, from a distance, come alive. Where the academic artist sees things arranged in regular planes, reducible to a pure theoretical design, that is to say, to a perspectival scheme, the Impressionist sees perspective established by 1,000 glimmers of tones and touches, by alterations in the air, which are mobile, not static. In sum, the Impressionist eye is the most advanced in human evolution, and up till the present, it has rendered the most complex combination of nuances ever known. How splendid! But the paradox or the contradiction of Laforgue's advocacy is that Impressionism is both thrillingly advanced and astoundingly regressive. The Impressionist painter has to ignore convention and forget precedent in order to regain the innocence of vision. Quote, forgetting the pictures accumulated for centuries in museums, forgetting his optical training at art school. We have this paradoxical awareness expressed by Monet himself, who told Lilla Cabot Perry, when you go out to paint, try to forget what objects you have before you. He told Lilla Cabot Perry that he wished he had been born blind and then had suddenly gained his sight so that he could have begun to paint in this way without knowing what the objects were that he saw before him. That will have to suffice as an introduction to primitivism. We must consider now the tremendous achievements of Paul Gauguin, who made an even more radical value of it. I am sending you a small series of woodcuts. They were engraved on ordinary wooden planks with deteriorating eyesight. They are really rough, rudimentary, and very imperfect, but artistically interesting, I think. These comments by Paul Gauguin were addressed in a letter to his friend Daniel de Montfrid, who was acting as Gauguin's de facto agent. Each print was in an edition of 30, and Gauguin put a price on them at 8 francs a piece, which was peanuts. In 1900, de Montfrid placed them with the art dealer Ambroise Vollard, but decided to take them back once he realized that Vollard was unable or unwilling to sell a single one of them. Gauguin's first series of woodblock prints had been produced in 1894 during a return journey to France from Tahiti. The imagery of his first series of woodcuts was reminiscent of his Tahitian paintings, sometimes directly referencing particular works, sometimes transposing them into a radically primitive idiom. 10 images were selected to be printed by a professional printer, Louis Roy, in an edition of 30, and these were intended to illustrate a forthcoming book, Noah Noah, whose publication, long delayed, only came out after Gauguin's death. But the prints for Noah Noah were exhibited almost immediately in an exhibition held in Gauguin's studio in Paris during December 1894. The trial proofs made by Gauguin were exceptionally rough and amateurish, the blotchy impressions smoothed by hand, bypassing the use of a printing press. Yet in the best of them, there is a rugged vitality of the imagery and handling that shines out. The professionally printed editions, there were at least 2 of these, are considerably less charismatic, but their diffusion caused a great stir across the entire world. The woodblock is the oldest medium of graphic reproduction. The earliest known woodblock prints were produced in China around 200 AD, and they began to be produced in the West, in Byzantium, around 900 AD. In medieval Europe, there was a thriving market for devotional imagery reproduced through woodblock printmaking, and the popularity of these established diverse traditions of folk art in several European countries that continued to flourish well into the early decades of the 20th century. The Lubki in Russia and the Image d'Épinal, which we've already glimpsed, these would have evolved out of those medieval popular idioms. The art historian Emmanuel Pernoud has suggested that the revival and transformation of woodblock printing by Gauguin and the artists of his circle doubles as an archaeology of the print. I quote, the woodcut is the infancy of printing. This new type of woodcut harks back to the crudeness of earlier times. The block is cut with a penknife in the direction of the wood grain and clearly displays its means. This is an art of nervures, chips, and splinters. Nervures, chips, and splinters. A nervure is the veining that occurs in wood. The shoreline of this image looks very much like it could be a nervure. Despite their rarity, Gauguin's woodcuts fell into the right hands and began to exert an influence. Guessing that his prints were all but unsaleable, he encouraged Daniel de Montfrid to distribute them among their mutual friends, which was how they found their way to Aristide Maillol, to Maurice Denis, and the Nabi artists, many of whom began to make their own woodcuts. The Norwegian artist Edvard Munch was in Paris in 1897 to 98 and was in close contact with the Nabis. During his stay in Paris, Munch made a dozen woodcuts, which were his first, and these in turn played a pivotal role in relaying Gauguin's primitivist aesthetic to the emerging expressionist artists in Germany. We'll come back to Edvard Munch presently. Through more or less the same route of transmission, the primitive woodcut came to be adapted by Kandinsky, Franz Marc, and others of their circle in the Munich region, and by contagion to their counterparts in Zurich, Hans Arp and Hans Richter, all of the last named artists among the earliest exponents of abstraction. Daniel de Montfried, Gauguin's de facto representative in France, while Gauguin was away in Tahiti and the Marquesas Islands. De Montfried was a painter. In 1889, he'd exhibited alongside Gauguin, Émile Bernard, and their colleagues in an exhibition organized by Gauguin, held in a cafe directly facing the entrance to the Universal Exhibition of 1889. In fact, it was located right beside the press office. The artists hoped to gain notice and notoriety and maybe make some sales, but all to no avail. Gauguin exhibited a series of lithographs, which include a reminiscence of his voyage to Martinique 2 years earlier, which prefigures not only the imagery, but the stylized, silhouetted shapes, the suggestion of organization into a frieze, the suggestion of a bas-relief, which would later lend itself so perfectly to his inspired foray into woodcuts. On the lower left, Gauguin's illustration for the cover of the exhibition brochure. Daniel de Montfried's name is inconsistently given as both Daniel on the poster and Georges Daniel on the catalogue cover. The artists exhibiting at the Café Volpini called themselves an impressionist and synthetist group, Groupe Impressionniste et Synthétiste. The image on the left was a gift from Gauguin to de Montfried, addressed to l'ami Daniel, the synthetist painter. And the gift would have been made at least 2 years after the Café Volpini show, possibly on the eve of Gauguin's first voyage to Tahiti. In the summer of 1905, 2 years after Gauguin's death, Daniel de Montfried was at his estate in the province of Roussillon in the Lower Pyrenees, not all that far from the coast. The sculptor Mayol was living in the vicinity, and he and de Montfried were the best of friends. Among the guests de Montfried received that summer were Henri Matisse and most probably also André Derain as well, both of whom were on a painting holiday in Collioure, a fishing village 80 kilometers away. The big attraction in visiting de Montfried's house was that at the time he had a stockpile of Gauguin's work, all of Gauguin's wood carvings, many paintings, and quantities of prints. These mightily impressed Matisse and Derain, and shortly after their return to Paris, they brought the primitivist woodcut to the forefront and made it a sort of flagship of Fauvism, the art movement they spearheaded, which had its debut in Paris, occurring almost immediately after Matisse and Derain returned from Collioure. These are two woodcuts by Derain and two by Matisse. We'll come back to them presently. They were part of an extremely important breakthrough, initiating a new chapter of modern art, the Matisses particularly. Of course, you'll be aware of the wild paradox Matisse confronts us with here, particularly in the print on the left, of a fastidiously woven together composition on the surface of the paper and an outrageously mangled and distorted representation of the female model. Three-dimensionality has been ruthlessly sacrificed to the integration of the image on the surface. Naturalism has been eviscerated in abeyance to a very rigorous, very brainy logic of abstract relationships understood here with dazzling clarity. I neglected to say earlier on that Matisse had been taught at the École des Beaux-Arts by none other than Bouguereau. Bouguereau, who was possibly still alive only just in 1905, but imagine what he might have thought of such a barbaric turn in the world of art. Some of the initial series of Gauguin's woodblock prints recast the compositions of existing paintings. In this case, the painting of a Tahitian scene was in fact painted in Paris, and the woodblock print would have been made not long afterwards. Here, one of the figures has been borrowed from a painting done in Tahiti 2 years earlier. The painting is now in the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. And the seated figure has been borrowed from another Tahitian painting now in the Pushkin Museum in Moscow. With strange literalness, Gauguin left out the hand masked in the painting by the tree branch. In this print, Gauguin conjures up a dualism of light and dark. The positive and negative shapes have more or less equal visual weight, and they're juxtaposed in a sequence where they seem to coexist organically and to flow out of one another, like a cluster of leaves and blossoms. The tightly interlocking shapes affirm the surface of the print in a frieze-like decorative manner. The body language of the figure with the raised arms is intriguing. As she enters the sea, is she responding to the sensation of the water and force of the waves? Or are her upraised hands an expression of fright? Has she caught sight of something alarming in the water? Do the swirling shapes appear to her as monstrous animal heads, faces of demons, or evil portents? Shapes and colors have an innate power of suggestion. That is an underlying assumption of Gauguin's art, and it's an assumption Gauguin's art shares with symbolist poetics, all of the art and literature of symbolism, as well as the influential texts of Edgar Allan Poe, for example, with their dark, foreboding menace. Poe's works were an important precursor, as was the brilliant precedent set by Charles Baudelaire, both as a poet and as a theoretician. These shapes and colors are hieroglyphics in the exact sense that Baudelaire gave them. The fact that they do not yield any obvious significance, the fact that they remain obscure and resistant, provides them with a certain longevity. Their indeterminacy serves to engage a viewer's imagination, to intrigue and to haunt us indefinitely. Gauguin compels us to realize that sophisticated, rational European adults share the same imaginative susceptibility as children and quote-unquote primitive people. The shapes that frightened the Tahitian girl are close forerunners to the abstract physiognomies in the ink drawings that Hans Arp did in 1915-1916. It's very striking how Arp's drawings adopt the stark contrasts of dark and light, of solid and void, of figure and ground that are characteristic of the woodblock print. Edvard Munch came to Paris in 1896 in order to design sets for a theatrical production of one of Ibsen's plays. This is one of Munch's lithographs done that year. Very stagey, very anecdotal, very much in tune with the brooding, morbid atmosphere that was such a keynote of Ibsen's and Strindberg's plays. In Paris, the director of the theatrical company that had engaged Munch was a man called Aurélien Lunier-Pot. And Lunier-Pot was at the forefront of the avant-garde theater in Paris, in which capacity he had allied himself with the painters of the Nabi group and with the acolytes of Paul Gauguin. It was through contact with these artists that Edvard Munch became aware of Gauguin's woodcut prints, and he produced his own series of woodcuts starting in 1896. Munch was an intrepidly experimental printmaker, as you can see in these variations. In Paris, he had the opportunity to assess the differences between various versions of Gauguin's woodcuts, and he consequently decided to do all of his printing himself, without using an assistant, without any professional intermediary. As you can see, he exploited to the maximum a thoroughly unprofessional technical crudeness, using rough wooden planks and ordinary carpenter's gouges and chisels. The wood grain is exposed and incorporated into the printed image. Munch would cut the woodblock into irregular shapes, which he could assemble and disassemble like a puzzle, inking and printing the parts separately, going over the image with gouache or watercolor or pastels. Everything was permitted. This is a remake of the print done in 1902 with the image reversed. Like Gauguin, Munch uses indeterminate shapes and enigmatic meanings for dramatic effect. Is the dark shape behind the girl in white a rocky outcrop on the beach, or is it an elderly chaperone in widow's weeds? Or is it the lurking presence of tragedy or death? What is the girl contemplating out at sea? Accidents in the printing have scattered phosphorescence across the dark blank and pricked it with starlight. As the historian Maurice Godet put it, wood engraving is by definition stylized and leaves as much to the imagination as it gives us to see. It is an advantageous means of expressing the visionary character of all perception. Everything that the innovative artists rejected in academicism was eliminated from the outset because of the very nature of the woodcut. Nuance, verisimilitude, anecdote, psychology, and concern for likeness. On the left, the heading of an article in the Blaue Reiter Almanac, written by the co-editor Franz Marc, highlighting Die Wilden Deutschlands, the wild men of Germany, in other words, the German Fauves. That was Marc's translation of the name given to Matisse, Derain, and their cohorts in France, who a few years earlier had made such a tremendous impression on Kandinsky when he was in Paris in 1906, where he'd seen the major showings of Fauvism and had taken the measure of their radical primitivism. The wild men of Germany initially called themselves the German Fauves. They were centered in Dresden and developed a strong rapport with the Blaue Reiter group in Munich. Eventually, in order to differentiate German from French, Fauvism came to mean French and Expressionism came to mean German, but for a time they were understood to be one and the same thing. Woodblock printmaking became a tremendous industry among the German Expressionists. Their woodcuts, schematic, abstracted character, served as a means of propaganda for the new art and were disseminated in innumerable publications throughout Germany and beyond into Eastern Europe and Russia. Franz Marc underlined his own Fauvist affiliations by more or less specializing in portraying wild animals in his paintings and prints. Animal vitality, animal sympathy, instinct, and spirit, these were extremely important universalizing notions for Franz Marc and Kandinsky, the co-editors of the Blaue Reiter Almanac. And to repeat a quotation from the last lecture, taken from William Hazlitt, which pertains perfectly to the Blaue Reiter's polemics, their muse is a leveling one. It proceeds on a level of equality and strives to reduce all things to the same standard. The Blaue Reiter Almanac is the apogee and the fulfillment of all the currents of primitivism we have examined so far. Reproduced between its covers, we encounter Gauguin and Van Gogh, Matisse and Picasso, 6 of the participants in the Brucker group from Dresden, the so-called wild men, art from Borneo, Alaska, Cameroon, Easter Island, Mexico, New Caledonia, the Marquesas Islands, Nigeria, unattributed naive, votive paintings, unattributed Chinese painting, and Japanese drawing, 6 reproductions of paintings by the douanier Rousseau, examples of Russian and Bavarian folk art, children's drawings from Germany, Egypt, and North Africa. That may sound like an exhausting list, but it's by no means exhaustive. There's plenty more besides, not least of which are the inclusions of woodcuts by Franz Marc and Kandinsky themselves, the only items which are in color. Their muse was a leveling one. It promoted equality and strove to reduce all things to the same standard. Clearly to me, if not to some other art historians, this was the foremost aim of the editors of the Blaue Reiter Almanac. In the Blaue Reiter Museum in Munich, these are 2 cabinets containing works by Kandinsky and Gabriel Munter with Bavarian folk paintings on glass or on mirrors. Such works were avidly collected by the Blaue Reiter artists who had no qualms about mixing their paintings up with the works of untrained amateurs. The leveling muse certainly had Matisse in thrall when he made the woodcut on the left and the painting on the right, both of them conspicuously indifferent to nuance, verisimilitude, anecdote, psychology, and likeness. If you remember Maurice Godet's characterization, the starkness and evenness of register in the woodcut, its conflation of foreground and background, solid and void, figure and field, is echoed in Matisse's approach both to the woodcuts and in his painting. And Derain's painting here on the left, also from Collier in 1905, gives almost every mark an equivalently emphatic, even, leveling register. This large and, for me, problematic, for me, in fact, pretty awful painting that Derain painted in 1906 is a sort of manifesto of fauve primitivism. The jarringly ugly and unassimilated yellow hand is one thing, the horribly galumphing feet are another, but this painting is an important testament to the primitivist ideals that informed fauvism and were greatly amplified 6 years later in the Blaue Reiter Almanac. Derain's idea of primitivism here is universalizing and eclectic as well as leveling. The figure on the left alludes to French Romanesque sculpture of the 11th century in the stylization of her draperies. The figure on the right suggests the stylization of Japanese prints, the golden-skinned beauties portrayed by Gauguin, also maybe a hint of Botticelli thrown in. While the 2 red nudes are quintessentially fauve, as you'll recognize from Derain's woodcut. This painting by Kandinsky, now in the Metropolitan Museum in New York, has taken on deliberately childlike qualities. There's a sun, but the sun is placed in the middle of the picture. Or is it a flower? Or is it a wheel? Or is it none of these things? The relationship between marks, shapes, and figures no longer corresponds to words and ideas. But we have what looks like the vestiges, the empty husks of figures and representational elements. It's very interesting to compare Kandinsky's painting with Gauguin's woodcut. I'm pretty well convinced that Kandinsky studied this particular woodcut and emulated it in this painting. The enfeebled drawing and the hollowing out of the figures in Gauguin's print is taken a step further by Kandinsky, scrambling the intimation of sea, sky, and land, reducing to whispers the inference of supine women, animals, a picket fence, a pagan idol, all of the trappings of a Gauguinesque Garden of Eden, sublimated here into a play of abstract pulsations, cadences, and punctuations that fill the shape of the picture and make a totality, a harmony, and synthesis of more or less non-representational parts. Reproduced in black and white in the Blaue Reiter Almanac, also turned into a color woodcut in Kandinsky's book Klänge, was this image of a horse, which first appears in a small painting Kandinsky did in 1910, and he clearly considered important enough to reproduce in both of these publications. The painting is now in the Kröller-Müller Museum in Rotterdam. It evokes the idea of a horse through very few elegant dynamic lines, and it obviously alludes to Paleolithic cave paintings and engravings which had recently come to light. It's worth remembering that Kandinsky was trained as an anthropologist, and as yet paleontology didn't exist as a science or academic discipline. The prehistoric cave paintings and engravings, which were becoming known at the time, couldn't be dated, and their authenticity and antiquity couldn't be agreed upon by would-be experts. However, given their leveling, universalizing disposition, Kandinsky and Franz Marc seem to have had no compunction embracing this evidence of creativity among our very remote ancestors. By titling his painting Lyrical, Kandinsky was acknowledging, or was claiming to recognize and to feel, the emotive charge, the ecstatic impulse behind the large gestures making up the Paleolithic artist's sprawling configurations, as if these were surges of some form of visual music. The overlaying and overlapping of outlines we find in cave paintings and engravings that are typical of them. It's called a palimpsest, or palimpsest, finds an echo in Franz Marc's prints. These ancient caves also feature inscriptions, symbols which can recur often and widely, which are called idiomorphs by paleontologists. generally regarded as early forms of writing. Now, of course, almost entirely indecipherable, but one could imagine how excited Kandinsky might be by descriptions of them, how the publication of drawings like this, published by the Abbé Breuil and Eugène Cartiac in the early 1900s, would have galvanized Kandinsky. Here is a woodcut Kandinsky published in Klänge in 1912 with an illustration of the ceiling engravings of the Cave of La Pileta in Malaga, discovered in 1905. And so the Western primitivist imaginary found its bedrock, so to speak, in the simultaneous discovery of our prehistory and the emergence of abstract art, with woodblock printmaking having served as an extremely important vector. I never imagined I would ever end a lecture by quoting Hitler, but that's the first time for everything. Hitler may have been wrong and despicable in just about every aspect, but here's one thing he got right in a statement from 1937. For all we care, those prehistoric Stone-Aged culture barbarians and art stutterers can return to the caves of their ancestors and there apply their primitive international scratching. To any artists watching this online, and I know there must be some, I wish you the courage and fortitude of your convictions to persevere most gloriously in continuing from the sanctuary of your caves, your primitive international scratching. Thank you for your interest. See you again.